For many modern readers, the Bible's stance on slavery is one of its most troubling and difficult aspects. The uncomfortable truth is that the Bible does not condemn the institution of slavery. On the contrary, both the Old and New Testaments contain laws and instructions that regulate it. Accepting it as a normal part of the social and economic fabric of the ancient world. To understand these texts, we must first examine the specific historical context in which they were written, which was very different from the race-based chattel slavery of the Americas. Though it was often still brutal, in the Old Testament, slavery was a widespread practice in the ancient Near East. It was not based on race. People typically became slaves because of debt, being captured in war, or being born to slave parents. The law of Moses, as recorded in books like Exodus and Deuteronomy, does not abolish slavery but attempts to regulate it and limit its cruelty, at least for fellow Hebrews. For example, a Hebrew who sold himself into slavery was to be set free after 6 years of service. Masters were commanded not to rule over their Hebrew slaves ruthlessly. However, these protections did not extend to foreign slaves. The law in Leviticus 25 is explicit. You may acquire male and female slaves from the nations that are around you. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life. The law also contained passages that clearly define slaves as property. Exodus 21 states that if a master beats a slave, and the slave dies after a day or two. In the New Testament, the context is the Roman Empire, an economy where as much as a third of the population were slaves. The early Christians were a tiny, powerless, and often persecuted minority. An open call for the abolition of slavery would have been seen as an act of insurrection and would have been brutally crushed by the Roman authorities. Instead of calling for abolition, the Apostle Paul's letters, written to churches within this system, seem to advocate for the status quo. In letters to the Ephesians and Colossians, he instructs slaves to obey your earthly masters with respect and fear. Apologists and many theologians argue that Paul was working for change from within this oppressive system. They point to his short letter to Philemon, a wealthy Christian slave owner. In the letter, Paul is sending Philemon's runaway slave, Onesimus, back to him. But he urges Philemon to welcome him back no longer as a slave, but better than a slave, as a dear brother. They argue this was a radical attempt to undermine the moral foundations of slavery by insisting on the shared humanity and spiritual equality of master and slave. However, critics argue that regardless of the original context, these same verses were used for centuries by American slave owners to justify the brutal institution of chattel slavery, forcing slaves to be docile and obedient. The texts are a stark reminder that the Bible is an ancient document, reflecting the moral realities of its time, which are often in profound and uncomfortable conflict with our ethical standards today.